Good evening, I'm Steve Kinane. Tonight, the opposing claims on the health dangers of wind farms fuel a bitter debate.
The fact is it won't go away, and there's no good reason for saying to people, you're not sick, it's all in your head.
We don't have evidence of alien abduction. Should we be spending public funds looking into it? No, we shouldn't.
But first, do you like a good zombie movie? Millions of viewers online like this Australian zombie film. The problem is they were downloading it for free via Pirate Bay. The government says it's illegal downloading of movies like this that must be stopped with a new website blocking bill about to be introduced to the Senate next week. The government's copyright amendment bill is designed to protect the interests of rights holders. If the new laws are passed, some like the big Hollywood studios will be able to use Australian courts to block overseas websites which offer pirated material. The bill has support from both the major parties and passed through the lower house this week.
There is no silver bullet to deal with piracy, with internet piracy. But this bill provides an important part of the solution to the problem of online copyright infringement. It's vital that copyright owners have an efficient mechanism to disrupt the steady supply of infringing content to Australian internet users from overseas-based websites.
After the bill had passed the lower house, Labor's Ed Husick criticised the legislation.
You've not once heard a rights holder say that if they get major gains in reducing piracy, this will flow through to prices and better accessible content. And I dare them to actually say it. They won't do it. They will not respond to consumers.
The Greens are calling for a series of amendments, but it now seems inevitable that the bill will pass the upper house. Critics claim it's impossible to block online piracy, and the new laws will allow current and future governments to censor whistleblowers. John Stewart and Benjamin Sveen produced this report.
Early this year, a new Australian zombie film called Wormwood became one of the most pirated movies in the world. Wormwood was released at the cinema in Australia in February, but there was no online video on demand available for 60 days. The film cost over $1 million to make, and its producers say there were thousands of illegal downloads.
As a result of that, we got pirated very heavily. We were in the top 10 in Pirate Bay out of all films in the world for about 2 weeks, which, you know, for an upcoming bunch of filmmakers, it's very good exposure, but it also means that you get absolutely hammered when it comes to actually recouping some of the costs that have gone into the film.
It's stories like these that have led the federal government to introduce new copyright legislation, and independent filmmakers applaud it.
I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it's really, really good. Obviously, a lot of these websites are operating outside of Australia, and to get some sort of way to, I guess, put up some sort of jurisdiction around that and to stop piracy, I think it's a very good thing.
If the laws are introduced and the Australian courts are used to block overseas piracy sites, they may run up against this man. Peter Sunder is the co-founder of Pirate Bay, one of the world's most popular sites for file sharing and illegal downloads. Last year he spent 5 months in a Swedish jail after being convicted of breaching copyright laws. Authorities around the world have been trying to shut down Pirate Bay since 2006, but it keeps re-emerging in some form in different countries.
Well, if you look at the countries that have tried to block piracy, and for instance in Denmark, just a few minutes away from here, they tried blocking the Pirate Bay, and what happened is that people found very easy ways to circumvent the block, and the traffic to Pirate Bay from those countries spikes afterwards, because people aren't stupid, and there's really easy alternatives to circumventing most of these legislations. So it becomes kind of a whack-a-mole game.
Despite the introduction of cheaper streaming services like Netflix and Stan, rights holders are still pushing governments around the world to block piracy sites and make people pay for content.
Well, Roadshow famously lost a big High Court of Australia case against iiNet over authorising copyright infringement. In response, Roadshow has made significant major political contributions to both the Coalition and the Australian Labor Party.
A spokesman for Village Roadshow said,
Village recognises that consumers want cheap, timely and easily available product, and we are working hard to deliver that. While we know they will not end piracy completely, the site blocking legislation and the draft code will be another tool in the toolkit to help all rights holders in the ongoing exercise of protecting their valuable creative content.
Critics say that governments could misuse the legislation and try and block sites used by groups like WikiLeaks.
There's a great deal of concern that the copyright bill could be deployed by governments or companies to censor access to websites that revealed particular whistleblowing information.
After spending time in prison, Peter Sunder still argues that file sharing and piracy benefits humanity more than it harms.
I go all around the world and I talk at conferences and I meet people from everywhere, and they all tell me how happy they are and how much Pirate Bay and file sharing changed their lives. That took them out of poverty because they could learn a trade and they could learn how to do things which made them part of society. So I think that you need to understand those things, and then, you know, me going to jail for a few months was not that bad actually. I'm super happy with what I did. I wouldn't have changed anything. I'm not the one that should be ashamed of what I did. It's rather that the industry had to lobby the much that they did in order to put me in the prison. They should be ashamed.
But the makers of Wormwood say that piracy is a cancer, destroying creative industries around the world.
Looking towards the future, if we're unable to get money for the product that we're putting out there, it just means that it's definitely unsustainable.
The Green Senator Scott Ludlam has been a vocal critic of the legislation and will be pushing for a series of amendments. I spoke to him a short time ago. Scott Ludlam, thanks for talking to us.
Good evening.
What is your problem with this bill?
My problem with it is that it seems to be attacking the issue from the wrong end, and what it will effectively leave Australia with is a really important building block for an internet filter, and I think it's the wrong way to attack the problem.
Okay, but we just saw in our story independent filmmakers like those who produce Wormwood. They're in favour of the bill. Are you siding with the freeloaders over the artists on this one?
No, I come from an arts background. I want artists to get the really important element of the story that you just put to air was that there was a 2-month window between the cinematic release and people who couldn't get to the cinema being able to get a hold of it. That is a very 20th century way of doing distribution, and that model is basically being eroded by the internet.
So are you suggesting that these corporations have brought piracy on themselves?
Well, effectively, if you give people a safe, convenient, reasonably cheap and rapid ability to access content, piracy collapses. There always will be a few freeloaders, but this bill is using a hammer to crack a nut. If you give people convenient ways of accessing content, very, very few people will be bothered to pirate stuff.
Do you really think that's the case? I mean, we have a generation of digital natives, many of whom don't pay for anything online, and even if the studios, the big movie studios did reduce their prices, did change their business model, what's to say that those people would pay for that product?
I actually think that really unfairly characterises an entire generation. I mean, people are used to the internet being a delivery platform that can provide free stuff, but piracy collapses in markets where people can get hold of content, and that's been replicated all over the world. Australia is being treated as this isolated little bubble where the rights holders think they might be able to maintain a 20th century distribution bottleneck that no longer exists, and they've persuaded the government because that's the only voices that the government's listening to.
Okay, so you're, as a legislator with a keen interest in copyright law, what do you think the solution is? How do you protect the copyright of artists like the filmmakers we just heard from? How do we stop them from being ripped off and allow them to make a living out of their art?
Well, the filmmakers in this instance are meat in the sandwich, because it looked to me as though nobody, unless you could get to the cinema where they happened to have released their film, nobody was able to get hold of the property, and that's why it ended up in the top 10 of Pirate Bay or wherever it was. If people are able to get hold of content, they won't hack it, and that, as I say, that experience has been replicated around the world. Australia will be no different.
Okay, so what do legislators do? I mean, we're talking about business models here. Corporations make those decisions.
Yeah, corporations do, and you've got these 20th century content monopolies that are desperately trying to hold on to a distribution bottleneck that basically we don't need anymore. It no longer exists. It's a pre-internet business model. If you make content available to people, you won't need an internet filter. What we've got is this, in my view, quite dangerous mechanism being brought forward where the hell is the rest of the copyright agenda? The Australian Law Reform Commission looked at not this issue but much broader issues around copyright reform in Australia years ago. There's still been no response. So as a legislator, what I would like to see is, can we please have the evidence on the table rather than just pressing ahead with an internet filter?
Will this bill work? Will it restrict internet piracy?
I think you probably would see in the short term, as they start wiping out particular sites that they think are of concern, and then people will work out how to circumvent it. So using VPNs, for example, if what the government is intending to do is, they can't pull these sites down, obviously, they can make them very difficult to view from within Australia. So people will use services that make your traffic appear that it's not coming from Australia. It's relatively easy to circumvent.
According to Choice magazine, they say that over 680,000 Australians are already using VPNs. Do you think that will grow as a result of this bill?
Well, it might grow, and obviously VPNs have a large number of legitimate uses, and one of the things that I'm quite worried about, and as are many others, is that this bill arguably criminalises use of VPNs. So one of the amendments that we'll be bringing next week, if the government brings debate forward, will be to make it absolutely crystal clear that we're not criminalising uses of VPNs.
Okay, is that really the case? Because Malcolm Turnbull has said the legislation is not intended to block virtual private networks, these VPNs.
Well, our advice basically is, when you're using language as broad as facilitating copyright infringement, that's way too broad. I would take the government's view on good faith. If they agree to our amendment and narrow the language in the bill, then it'll be shown that they mean it.
Let's talk more about that. This legislation is meant to block websites that infringe copyright, but also facilitate infringement. What does facilitate mean?
You tell me, Steve. Facilitate, like the internet facilitates infringement. Web browsers, mobile phones facilitate infringement. That language is dangerously broad. Effectively, that goes to the nature of the amendments that we'll be bringing. Our first call on the government, to be honest, and I hope the Labor Party will support this because they said very similar things in the House of Representatives this week, is the bill should be delayed. It should not proceed until the Australian government's come forward with its responses to two key inquiries into this issue, both of them which were conducted well over a year ago.
All right, you say dangerous. Dangerous in what way?
I think it's very dangerous to set up a site blocking mechanism that could potentially criminalise such a wide variety of platforms and sites. That is very, very problematic. You know, we fought an internet filter to a standstill years ago, and it's quite distressing to see it returning in this form.
So are the Greens, in a sense here, arguing for trade liberalisation on movies and music?
Well, industry seems to be all about deregulation until its interests are suddenly caught in the crosshairs. What we are seeing is a 20th century business model that has been very rapidly eroded. They could have seen it coming, and in other countries they have. They're trying to protect that monopoly by getting the government to legislate and to re-regulate a sector that doesn't really need it. Just make the content available and people will start ripping it off.
Okay, is this deregulation though, or is this endorsing theft? Because this is what they're saying, this is thieving from artists and from industry.
I don't endorse theft. I come from an arts background. I want to see artists, particularly Australian artists, get paid for their work. But if you listen to the experts or you look at experience around the world, site blocking regimes, they're not going to be a magic bullet for copyright infringement, and they can immediately be broadened and their scope can be broadened. Every time there's some other moral panic, somebody's going to come forward saying, we should use your site blocking regime to block this and that and the other. That's the slippery slope that we're on now.
Scott Ludlam, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.